Welcome to the Executive Innovation Show podcast, where we bring you real executive conversations with industry game changers and thought leaders. We ask the questions you're thinking, what you're scared to ask, and we make your brain hurt afterward. With your host, Carrie Chitsey Wells, co-founder and CEO of One Touch Video Chat, live video interviews, and the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's podcast. This is part of our nonprofit series on really highlighting people that are doing amazing things and talking about topics that are going on in the industry today. I have my co-host with me today, Daniel Miller, who is the COO of the nonprofit Humans Helping Humans. Daniel, are we ready to talk about the opioid epidemic and its impact on first responders?
Yes, definitely, Carrie. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so the opioid crisis has really affected pretty much everybody in the U.S., and more Americans have died from opioid overdoses than breast cancer. It's cost the country over $500 billion a year, and one area that most people don't talk about as much that we want to talk about today is just really the downward effect that it's had on our first responders. With the dramatic increase in overdoses, first responders in every county have really had an increase in OD-related calls, and this is really taxing on our first responders. In a lot of cases, they're going out to an overdose call, administering Narcan, and literally going to the same house multiple times a day. So we focus a ton on, really combating the opioid crisis and the communities it's affected, but we really don't highlight the adverse effects that it's really been having on our first responders on a daily basis. Especially with the introduction of fentanyl, which, as some of you may know, is elephant tranquilizer on the street. This has really put a lot of the first responders in very dangerous situations as they're going to search cars, as they're, responding to these overdoses. That exposure to the fentanyl alone can really create overdoses to our first responders, heart attacks, strokes, respiratory issues. So it's pretty scary out there if you're a first responder. Daniel, what other risks are really going on with the first responders that we want to talk about today?
So specific to first responders, there's quite a few risk factors that we're seeing increasing kind of day by day. One of the first things that we're seeing is an increase in compassion fatigue. So compassion fatigue is a stress that results from the first responders wanting to help or helping people on a regular basis that are so close to death or that have overdosed and things of that nature. The second thing that we're seeing is an increase in powder-like fentanyl. And this substance becomes airborne, and it's created new procedures for searching cars, responding to overdoses in houses, and generally just responding to overdose calls all around. And then probably the most serious thing that we're seeing is an increase in depression and mental health and even addiction and alcoholism with first responders. So this can lead to an increased PTSD from seeing so much death.
So today we're going to talk to a couple of first responders to really hear firsthand what's going on, how it's really affecting them and their coworkers. And we're going to really ask some pointed questions and try to understand a little bit more directly from the first responders what's going on.
We have a great guest with us today. We have Mark Lamplugh, who's the director of Deer Hollow Recovery and also the communications director for the Institute for Responder Wellness. He's also a fourth-generation firefighter himself and former captain in the fire department. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Well, great. We've been talking a lot about the opioid crisis and really its effect on first responders, and really wanted to talk to you about, first responders from the fire department perspective are really on the lines more than they ever have been before on responding to overdoses and, EMT. How has that really, affected the fire side or EMT side from a first responder perspective? Maybe you could explain a little bit of background of why there's so much kind of fatigue and mental health and, addiction related to that.
Sure. Well, as far as with the with firefighters and EMT goes, and a lot of people probably don't realize this, but years ago, firefighters were firefighters, and then paramedics and EMTs were paramedics and EMTs. So the EMS, they did their job, and the firefighters, they sat around the firehouse until they had a fire, and then they went to that call. Well, over the years, it has changed, and those roles have combined. Many departments nowadays, you can't even become a firefighter unless you got like 2 years of a paramedic school or you're an EMT. And those roles have kind of combined, one, to save cities money, because a lot of the cities realized, hey, we're paying all these guys to sit around all the time to fight fires while there's not many fires. So we can use that time that they're sitting around and use them for other ways. So the stress of that is, it's tenfold because you're not getting the recuperation that you used to get after you go to a fire for 2 hours and you pack all the hose and you're tired and worn out. You would go back to the station and relax until the next fire. Well, now you're consistently running calls because you're running all those EMS calls as well. So what's happening with the overdoses is they're getting so many of them, that they're not getting that rest that they need, and they're, going pretty much one after another.
Yeah, especially in rural areas, it's even worse than the urban cities because there's not as many firefighters and EMT. Is that why it's impacted the rural areas worse? Or tell me a little bit about that.
Well, another reason why I think it has impacted the rural, that's one of the reasons. Another one being that's where the opioid crisis is impacting, because these are the type of individuals, these kids that are becoming addicted to these drugs. They're going into the inner cities where they're buying these drugs, and they're bringing them back to the communities. So these fire departments and these EMS personnel, they're not used to this problem, and it's coming home to them too. And a lot of these guys, they know these people, that are going to these calls, and they're brothers or family members of guys in the departments and stuff like that. So that also is another reason why it's, I think, hurting in a lot of ways. But with this opioid epidemic isn't just the inner city drug areas. This is hitting blue collar, working family towns. Well, as you know, it doesn't have, there's no, it doesn't matter who you are, rich,
right,
poor, you're affected by this. And I think it's just catching up to these guys because they're not used to it. And I was doing some research before the show to kind of look at some of the numbers to try to figure out when this kind of started happening. Because when I started in the fire department, I grew up in a firehouse, so I was born there. All my father is still a president of the fire department. My grandfather was the chief. The fire department that I ran calls with, our pictures were on the wall. They have an award named after my great grandfather. They give that every year. Wow. I don't remember this happening. From '96 when I became what's called a junior member. I was still in high school, and then when I turned 18, I became an active, or was allowed to go into burning buildings and stuff like that. Up until 2010 is when I was kind of real active in fighting fires and stuff. Up until 2010, this epidemic we didn't have this problem. I don't remember any kids in school dying of overdoses. I don't remember really going to many calls. Here and there you would go, but now it's an everyday occurrence. Yeah. And I think that all kind of started happening around probably 2012 is when it kind of really started spiking. And I looked at the numbers. I think 2016, there were 60-some thousand overdoses in the U.S., which was 5 times higher than it was in 1996.
Yep. And then in 2017 is, more than
breast
cancer. Yeah. People die of breast cancer. So one of the other things that I wanted to get your thoughts on as being a firefighter is, there's been so much, safety issue with fentanyl being on the streets, and fentanyl, is, for those who don't know, is 100 times more powerful than heroin, and can get airborne, and first responders are, going down because obviously, they go to somebody's house or they pull somebody over or whatever it may be, they're not actively saying, hey, I have fentanyl on me or it's in my house or whatever. With the firefighter, equipment or EMT and so forth, is there, do you see changes in that coming, to keep the first responders safe? Or, why is, it's such, with equipment and stuff out there, is there any way to combat that?
I think we discussed this, prior, and when we were going to talk about this. So I did a little bit of research as far as, and I have seen some videos where police officers had went down on the scene because they had touched something, whether it be fentanyl or whatnot. So there has been a lot of stuff going out that this is becoming an issue. But then I just read an article the other day on I think it was an EMS website, EMS One or EMS World, where they were saying a lot of that is not really actually happening. It's kind of more hoaxes of people kind of talking about it online. That's kind of spread some misinformation, if you will. It's not as pertinent a problem as it's kind of being made out to be. So I don't know, whether that's the case or not. They do protect themselves. They try to wear gloves. That's mandatory for any call you go on. With firefighters, it's a little different because the type of gloves they usually wear aren't the medical, kind when they're going on accidents and stuff like that. So, I mean, it could really just be coming down to putting those medical gloves underneath the gloves that they use to protect themselves from the equipment. And maybe wearing, something on the face, like a mask of some sort, so that if there's anything lethal that could come up into your bloodstream or your body, that you're protected.
Right.
And it's almost the same way as you would protect yourself kind of with the HIV virus or, hepatitis or whatnot.
Right.
Just got to be extra cautious that these things can be there, because I'm sure that if you do come in contact with this stuff, it can be deadly.
Yeah, so my favorite show on Friday and Saturday nights is Live PD. Do you watch Live PD, Daniel?
No, that's not one that I've seen, but I do watch some of the other shows that are out there.
Yeah. Have you seen Live PD, Mark?
No, I haven't. I more watch the fire shows unless it's cops on Saturday.
Oh. Well, I am a huge Chicago Fire fan, so let me just throw by Chicago Fire. But on Live PD, they're live following around like 6 different cities at the same time, and it's live. I mean, they're not taping, editing, whatever. And, we talk a lot about the opioid and so forth. And for the first time last weekend, I forget if it was on Friday or Saturday night, I'll have to find the episode. This police officer was going through the purse of this woman, and she didn't know. Well, maybe she knew, I don't know, but she didn't know it was fentanyl. It was laced with something. I forget if it was cocaine or something else or whatever. The police officer literally fell over and was going into a seizure right on Live PD from the fentanyl.
Oh,
so all the police officers, they were calling EMT not only for the lady but for this, and it was the first time I'd literally seen it live of the exposure to fentanyl, and the cop was just literally they were trying to hold his head and so forth. He wasn't having a heart attack. It was if it had caused a respiratory or whatever. He was literally seizing out right on Live PD. So it was kind of crazy from that perspective.
Yeah, I had seen one where the officer was on video. I think it might have been in Ohio, and he was conscious one minute, and next minute he was like out on the ground, and they had to give him Narcan, to bring him back.
Yeah, they gave him Narcan on Live PD too. Yeah, that's interesting.
So, Mark, I wanted to talk a little bit about your work at Deer Hollow Recovery.
Sure.
And specifically as it relates to the first responder trauma program at Deer Hollow.
Yes.
Is it both substance abuse and mental health that are focused on first responders, or can you talk a little bit about that?
The whole program is focused. It's a very intensive trauma program, and we work with first responders and also general population. We just use one house to put responders in and another house for the general population when we can. Okay. But we also have primary mental health. So we are one of the few programs in the country that work in trauma that can take a client or a first responder into the program that doesn't have a substance abuse issue. And I've been working with these programs for about 10 years now at different places, and they always needed to have a primary substance abuse diagnosis to be into the program. And this is one of the first places that I've been. And that's why I'm so in love with the place. And I think they're doing such a great job, is to be able to treat these guys before they have the substance abuse. Now, oftentimes we know a lot of those things go hand in hand, for self-medicating and what have you. But a lot of the first responders that have reached out to me, I wasn't able to help them in the past because we had to have the substance abuse. So we are able to take primary mental health, but we also treat both.
That's really, really incredible work. And how would you describe the differences between the treatment for your first responder treatment program? How does that differ from the regular treatment program?
Pretty much all of it's the same. They basically get, regardless of where they're at, over 35 hours of trauma-informed groups a week. I guess the difference being with the first responders is a lot of the groups are going to be, discussing responder-related issues, as in, general population aren't going to be discussing those things.
Right.
And the clinicians that work with the first responders, they have extensive experience working with the issues that first responders come in with. But the program as a foundation is laid out identical, because whether it's trauma with a first responder or trauma with a rape victim or what have you, it's still the underlying core issues are the same. It's just the different work environments that they may have, and some of the stressors that they're going to have when they return back home after they complete a program.
Wow.
But it's a very heavily intense group program with almost 40 hours a week, 35 hours a week, trauma-informed groups. And that's not including all the other stuff they do.
Wow. And, we've heard a lot from folks who work with first responders and veterans, people who have had that type of trauma that's different from the trauma that people have that aren't first responders or veterans. And we're hearing that they're almost scared to come forward, given that mental health provided through their department, just because they're afraid of being, quote unquote, tagged, and they might not be able to return back to the field. How do you think that we can change that, and what solutions are working to kind of break that fear?
I think that, that's one of the main reasons first responders, like you said, have trouble coming forward. One, they're afraid they're going to lose their job. And two, they don't want to be labeled, or the stigma that there's something wrong with them. They're the helping kind, and in the job or role as a first responder, you're the one that people call for help. So you can't need help. You're
Right.
too strong. So
There's kind of a stigma almost with that.
Yeah. I think a lot of it comes down, and I think it's really starting to kind of change. It's not where it needs to be, but there has been a shift in the mentality since I've been doing this, to where it was 10, 15 years ago. Now that there's kind of an understanding, and we're starting to learn that these things aren't debilitating completely your whole life. You can get well from these. Mm-hmm. You can go back to work. You can continue your job. And sometimes, in my opinion, these guys are often better than they were before, because now they're able to kind of contribute in a different way and be able to help others that may be struggling, because they have a new type of mindset and education of themselves and the issues.
They're almost able to relate a little bit,
giving them places they can go where they can reach out for help, such as the nonprofit that I volunteer for, the Institute. Where they can kind of talk to other first responders that have been through those issues, kind of vetted out resources to know where they can go, that is going to be able to help them, or maybe has worked with public safety people or veterans, and that they can kind of walk them through the process, when they do reach out.
Yeah, no. Yeah, you guys are doing great work, and it's so great that you're involved not only with Deer Hollow, but several nonprofits to really give back to the first responder community. So we appreciate that. Hey, Mark, one final question before we go. Do you know what percentage of first responders, like a national number or something, to have mental health or substance abuse issue? Is there any numbers that you guys typically use?
I just did I was writing a press release for our facility, just went in network with First Health Network, which is a insurance. So it's our first insurance that we're now accepting in network. Mm-hmm. So I was creating a press release for that. So I had to get online and look up some stats, to talk about how many police officers and firefighters had these issues. There's so many studies out there, and it's so hard to in my opinion, it's so hard to get these accurate numbers, because if you give this survey to 100 cops, are they going to be honest that they are having the issues?
Right, never.
So you have that. One of the ones I just looked at this today because of what I'm doing said 20% of police officers have a diagnosis of PTSD. 30% meet some sort of criteria for PTSD. With firefighters, I've seen numbers from 7% to 37% have PTSD. I saw a study where Israel did a study on their firefighters, and they came up to 80% or something like that had some sort of symptoms related to PTSD. Yeah. So I think it's a problem. In my opinion, if 5% have it, they still need to be treated and, get the help that they need, whether it's 1 or 100.
Couldn't agree with you more, Mark. Well, Mark, we really want to thank you for being on the show. This is the first part of a multi-part series for first responders, so feel free to ask any additional questions you might have for other first responders or questions for Mark. This podcast has come to a close. Feel free to share, rate, and review this podcast. Stay tuned for next week's show.
This podcast has come to a close. To hear more from the Executive Innovation Show podcast, subscribe, submit questions, and share the love. Follow us on social. We're everywhere.